Welcome. My name is Justin Bengry. I'm one of the editors of Notch's Remarks on the History of Sexuality, and we have a feature that we've been running for about a year now or so, talking about new works in the history of sexuality with authors. And this is part of our feature, Notches on the Bookshelf. And I'm joined today by Charles Upchurch, who is, well, a associate professor, very soon to be full professor of British history at Florida State University, and the author previously of Before Wild, Sex Between Men in Britain's Age of Reform. And today we're talking about your new book, Chuck, Beyond the Law, The Politics of Ending the Death Penalty for Sodomy in Britain. I'm so excited to see the book. I'm so excited to talk about this. But first of all, thank you for joining me today. Thank you for joining me from across the pond. You're in the States, and here I am in London.
All right, and thanks so much for putting this together, Justin. I mean, following Notches for years and years, it's such a wonderful space to keep up with what's going on in the field, and I'm just really excited to be able to share my work with you and the whole Notches audience.
Oh, thanks so much. Well, I mean, I think also it's important work that you're doing. I mean, you're really changing our understanding of the early 19th century, of activism in the past, of the kind of work that was done to change the law. And I think, well, I saw you present on this work years ago in Manchester at an earlier stage, and was just enthralled because it was already at that point changing my understanding of the kind of work that had been done for law reform long before I realized work was being done for law reform. So I think it has a really important part of changing the historiography. So well, let's dive right in. I mean, if you could tell us, first of all, can you just describe the overarching argument of the book and what you're getting across in it?
All right. Yeah, I think one of the things that's most important about the book is that there was this organized movement to get rid of the death penalty for sodomy in the early 19th century. And I think we've sort of shied away from investigating anything having to do with politics and queerness in that period, right? Because it's before the classic start of LGBTQ identity, right? Homosexual identity. But I think that that paradigm was really set a very long time ago, right? And I think that work, especially Anna Clark, what she's done with Anne Lister and the Chevalier d'Eon, and thinking about the ways in which cultural texts from the late 18th and early 19th century were used by individuals like Anne Lister and others to think about same-sex desire as being sort of integral to their self-understanding, but not exactly in the same terms as modern homosexual identity, and that this can play a part in the motivation of individuals and how individuals shape their lives. So I think that opens the door for thinking about this to some degree. But the other big part of it is that this is a human rights story as well, too. And you don't need a concept of modern homosexual identity to have an ethical problem with executing people for a private consensual act. That's a real core of this. And Jeremy Bentham is right at the start of the story. We're all indebted to what Lewis Crompton found out about Bentham, right? In the Lewis Crompton's writings in the 1970s, where he discovered Bentham's essay on pederasty, the 70 manuscript pages. Wonderful find. But Crompton wrote that Bentham kept this secret for fear of destroying his reputation, right? And that's what we've been saying ever since. So there's been this idea out there that, yes, while the greatest legal reformer of the age knew that the executions for a private consensual act were just, ridiculous and ought to be overturned, there was this idea that he kept these ideas secret for his entire life for fear of damaging his reputation. But in fact, what I found is that he didn't keep them secret. And it's not those 70 manuscript pages published, but there are 5 key paragraphs that are in his most prominent work of legal reform, The Principles of Morals in Legislation. And this is the book that is cited by people reforming the Napoleonic Code, people reforming the law codes in South America, people reforming law codes in the liberal states of Central Europe and in Britain a few decades later. And this book has these 5 paragraphs where he argues that to declare something unnatural is not a rational basis for law. And he makes other arguments that basically undermine um, the use of any penalty for sex between men beyond the mildest possible punishment. This is in his published work. And I know people were citing this because I've backtracked references from people in the debates in the 1830s and 1840s, where they are citing these passages in Bentham. So one of the things that this sort of changes is, Bentham didn't keep these ideas secret. Anyone interested in law reform could draw on Bentham. And this kind of helped to underpin the activity of numerous other people that I've found in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s when law reform is actually happening, right? Law reform doesn't even begin until, right, the second decade of the 19th century, and then it's very halting, and then it comes like a flood, right, once the Whigs take over after 1830. But so yeah, it's just a very different story. And following the politics of it is what really made it open up for me, I think. I'm going to go ahead and pause and let you jump in. I talked for a long time there. I don't want to.
No, that's okay. I mean, I was wondering actually, how did we lose sight of these statements by someone as important as Bentham, published in important works that were cited cited by his contemporaries and used by others in a global context? How did we lose sight of such important statements in favor of the kind of myth that Bentham was hiding all of this material?
Right. Well, that's a great question, and I kind of like grappled with that a little bit at first as well too. But the thing about it is that the people who wrote high politics in previous generations just would have ignored it, right? They wouldn't have drawn attention to it. The people in the period also too didn't really want to draw attention to it. This idea that men don't talk about sex between men publicly is absolutely right. But it's, so it's not surprising that it isn't prominent within individuals' memoirs. Although once you learn what the passages are, I mean, Lord John Russell is paraphrasing them on the floor of the House of Commons in 1840, right? And they show up in other ways as well. And in fact, I personally found these because there is part of the political story. I mean, this was a real detective story, right? Jeffrey Weeks, calls it, right, historical detective work, a triumph of historical detective work. I love that Jeffrey said that. I mean, it's wonderful, like when your heroes, right, sort of someone who I've admired his work for so long, like something that I put together. But yeah, because what it was is that I had identified by that point that 1835, there was a bill put forward to end the death penalty for sodomy. This hasn't been in the historiography at all up to this point, and it really ties in with the execution of the last two individuals for sodomy in Britain, right? Smith and Pratt. So actually, while they are on trial for execution, this bill has already passed in the Commons. So all of the elected representatives of Britain have agreed that there should no longer be the death penalty for sodomy. But it stalls on the House of Lords, and it gets pulled from consideration on the House of Lords. Immediately, Lord John Russell takes the committee that's reviewing the law code in general, and he tasks it with, tell me what should have the death penalty from this point forward and what shouldn't. And one of the guys on the six-man committee is named John Austin. And I knew already that John Austin was a great friend of Bentham, and that Bentham had helped him get his job at his first academic job. And I mean, they were tight, they were neighbors. And so I thought, if Bentham would have shared his secret writings on the sodomy law with anyone, maybe he shared them right with Austin at this moment when this tasking of the committee to do this was tied so directly to the House of Lords, failing to consider this bill and the executions happening. So when Austin's papers were destroyed in World War II, but his copy of Bentham survives. And he actually, well, I'm assuming it was him, I'm almost certain it was him, underlined these critical passages within that copy. And that was how it first sort of, by backtracking the political, because I was just assuming Crompton was right. And you've got to read carefully to get them, right? It's not like this is right there, obvious in the index or anything like that. But if you read the whole book slowly and carefully, it's clear. He does part of the argument at the start where he says unnatural is no basis for anything in the law. He said, therefore, if we're going to have a law about this, it has to be based on other premises. And then he reviews what those other premises are later in the book. This is also a 300-page book on what the law should and should not cover for every type of crime and what the scale of punishments should be for every type of crime. So if there's only 5 paragraphs, that kind of stands to reason, right? But it's there embedded in this very large argument. So yeah, the people doing high politics, back before the 60s would have not drawn attention to this. And LGBTQ history basically has always been in the social history, cultural history, gender history, Foucauldian methodology, which really didn't privilege the idea that we should reconstruct the high political debates that led to this. And so I really think not only for the end of the death penalty for sodomy, but there are other areas too, where doing a kind of a traditional high politics methodology pulls you to all sorts of conversations and all sorts of evidence that we wouldn't have found otherwise. I mean, that's sort of one of the kind of things that the book does, right? We follow the legislation and the trail of it, but so much of the story comes out just by the connections that are preserved, by looking at this trail of evidence led by this legislation working its way through Parliament, right? How many times it was stopped, how many times that it almost passed but didn't. And then ultimately, too, the story of who were the men who actually fought for it, right? Because there are really only 2 people that fought for the bill. That's why 1840 and 1841 are the real critical showdown. In 1835, there's actually a magistrate who writes a letter to Lord John Russell, soliciting opinions from judges about why is this still, on the books. And one of the magistrates writes back and says to Russell, I firmly believe that the only reason why the penalty of death still applies for this crime is the difficulty of finding anyone hardy enough who would undertake what might be construed as a defense of the crime, right? i.e., if you're going to have a bill, you're going to have somebody to fight for it. And nobody wants to be the guy who stands up and gets publicly associated with saying we should have lesser penalties for sex between men, even though most people in Parliament are willing to vote for it, right? Both in 1835 and 1840 and 1841. Lord John Russell supports it. I know it because he drafts a second bill just in case this effort of the backbenchers fails. It only goes up for 1 reading in the Lords, but it's right there in the record. And it's just about ending the death penalty for sodomy. So that stigma is real. The 1835 kind of falls flat because the guy who proposes it isn't willing to fight for it in 35 also. He's a backbench MP. The government wants to get this passed, but they don't want to face the stigma for having done it. They want it to be a backbencher bill, right? A private member's bill. And, even as they're sort of doing things that sort of like help to move it along. So you really kind of have to get into the nitty-gritty of the parliamentary process. But when you do, you really can see how many people cared about this and what they were and were not willing to do in order to make it pass and to make it happen. And I think that just is it opens kind of a treasure trove of private attitudes about what sex between men meant in this period. And another thing I was not expecting is so many of the arguments were about sodomy between men and women, right? Because if you're going to get something through Parliament, you have to give MPs a reason to vote for it. And so there's this argument that's crafted that I wholly didn't expect, that that the sodomy law hurts every married man because it gives the state the right to intrude into the bedchambers of every private couple. And what a man and woman choose to do with each other, a married man and woman choose to do with each other in the privacy of their own bedchamber in order to keep their interest in each other, so to protect the sacramental space of their marriage, should be their own business and not the business of the state. And the state has just usurped the right to police this prohibition that the church had which is the church's responsibility anyway. So there's actually this entire sort of Anglican argument for getting rid of the sodomy law that it factors into the debate. It's not debated on the floor of the Commons, but it's found in ancillary materials that sort of I discovered as I was moving through this process. So, you know, that really helps us get inside the head of the early 19th century individuals. It's not done on anti-religious terms. It's about defining the end of the death penalty for sodomy in ways that are compatible, right, with utilitarian philosophy, but also to even Christianity, and the best version, the latitudinarian version of Christian doctrine, even as it's opposed vehemently by the more evangelical Christians, which are the ones who ultimately end up killing the 1840-1841 effort.
It's absolutely astonishing to hear how far movement toward reform actually got in the Commons and how much support there was. And it sounds like really, but for the particularities of the English parliamentary or the British parliamentary system, it might well have gone through, except for these additional hurdles that needed to be overcome in the Lords and final stages. So it really upends, I think, our understanding of the 19th century, of people in the 19th century, of the beliefs and values they held, and upends that idea that it's universally draconian, or to use more contemporary terms, homophobic, when in fact there was interest in changing the law. I think this is absolutely fascinating that it's in some ways, yeah, almost procedural that it didn't succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I felt like I kind of had to address to some extent that that image that's out there, right? So often done with the Beer Street Molly House raid, right? I think we've all read descriptions of this 1810 event where it talks about, you know, people lining the streets, you know, 4 and 5 deep on the rooftops just to vilify and throw offal and dead cats at the sodomites, right? You know, space being arrayed around the pillory so the women could have the closest you know, sort of, line of attack, right, on these people. So great was this hatred. And the thing about it is that I felt like that I had to sort of like explain that to some degree. And I really think that I was able to show just how anomalous that was and how it actually really kind of ties into the Duke of Cumberland scandal that had happened just a couple of weeks before. In fact, if you asked anybody what the biggest scandal is, like say in mid-June, related to sex between men in Britain in 1810, they would have said clearly the Duke of Cumberland scandal, right? Where a member, right, the Duke of Cumberland, at one time second in line to the British throne, was accused of murdering, right, his servant, you know, in their apartments, right? It was it a suicide or was it a murder? It was suspicious. And a lot of people felt there were a lot of accusations that there had been something sexual between these two men, and that this was part of what had led to the murder in St. James Palace. Of course, there's a lot of rumor and innuendo flying around, but the thing that Veer Street really does is it knocks that out of the headlines. And there is this tradition of newspaper editors actually feeling like, and I talk about this in the book, of kind of exaggerating the indignation at homosexual acts, right? Sex between men, sodomites, in order to ensure that the public never gets complacent about this. And there is this effort to kind of enhance the sort of public vilification of these individuals, you know, in part, I mean, you can't say directly, but I mean, the way these two things line up and other statements, I mean, I'm going to have to let the argument in the book sort of handle a lot of those details. But I think Veer Street is very anomalous, and the proximity to the Duke of Cumberland scandal is something that people really should keep in mind when they're thinking about it. And it is very much not the attitude of a significant proportion of the society. Now, there is certainly animosity towards sex between men. I mean, there are evangelicals who will get up on the floor of the House of Commons and say that this should be punished with execution, right? But what we've forgotten is that there's a sizable faction who disagreed with this and who were less vocal, but who, you know, felt in some cases just as strongly. and wanted to counter it. There was a real debate going forward from the late 18th and early 19th century about the ethics of executing men for sodomy, and even about the whole prosecution and persecution of sex between men. There are a lot of people who will argue that we can get rid of the laws because just the societal sanctions, right? The prejudice that people feel against this will be enough to hold the behavior in check. We don't have to have the law. We don't have to be so much harsher than the laws on the continent and other places. So, and I've tried to recover that debate. I spend a less time on the animosity towards sodomites, just because that's been so well documented. So most of the book is about these, more positive or neutral or reform-minded attitudes that I've been able to uncover, which really informed the political debate that I've been able to piece together.
Well, it's so crucial to have that side of the those perspectives, because I think we do have in a wider consciousness a very black and white view of history, that the past must be radically different. Values must be so much more retrograde. The vehemence against people today defined as LGBT or self-identified as LGBTQ+ must be so much more awful. And certainly there's plenty of examples of trauma, pain, violence in the past, but it's so important to show that it's not the only story, and to get this perspectives on reform is just really exciting to learn that. I want to go back to your comments about Austin, actually, going back to the his copy of Bentham. I mean, this is just so exciting to find sources like that where you've got, okay, you don't know it's in his hand, but there's a preponderance of evidence that his copy, those passages, this issue, it's an exciting possibility, even if not absolutely watertight confirmed, but really exciting as an historian to know about that kind of source. But I'm wondering then, a lot of this then is really about tracing and recreating those networks of men and tracing these relationships. And you talked about that somewhat already, but I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how you went about reconstructing these networks and finding who communicated with whom and what the nature of that communication was. 200 years on, it seems, yeah.
Right. And that's where these digital tools have been super helpful with this. I couldn't have done this 10 years ago without the digitization of the UK parliamentary papers. I couldn't have done it without Hathi Trust. I mean, books that when I did my dissertation, I had to go to the UK and read, in a library, very slow to get through, or in some cases, right, the locked cabinet in the British Library as well. Now you can get access to so much of this, and the ways in which these kind of conversational, almost kind of like insider chatty limited edition books from the early 19th century that help to reconstruct bits of the story. Ways that people tried to hide things with allusions, right? Either literary allusions or obscure references. I can kind of track those down. The other thing that was really unexpected is the family networks. And because at the core, right, to answer that question of who was hardy enough to do this, I found this kind of amazing thing. The bill in 1840 and 1841, this is something that Jeffrey Weeks had talked about in about a few sentences, right? This 1841 effort had been known about. Nobody had written more than a couple of lines about it in the past, though. He was drawing on Leon Radzinowicz's right, History of English Criminal Law, the four-volume work, and that work has a few paragraphs about it, but it attributes the bill to Lord John Russell. But Lord John Russell actually didn't put forward the bill, right? What I was able to do by sort of sleuthing through the parliamentary papers is to find, in fact, two guys, Fitzroy Kelly and Stephen Lushington, co-sponsored this legislation. And I wanted just to dig into them, right, a little bit. Why would they do it, right? Because by then I knew this idea of finding someone hardy enough to do this. What could help to explain? As it turns out, Fitzroy Kelly's brother was William Kelly. Fitzroy, and they were both the sons of Isabella Kelly, the novelist, and the great friend of Matthew Gregory Lewis, right? Matthew Gregory Lewis, the Gothic novelist, who has been sort of, his same-sex desires were discussed in his lifetime, right, as well as by scholars throughout the 20th and the 21st century. And if you read the material that goes back as early as the 1930s, William Kelly is singled out as the absorbing passion of Matthew Gregory Lewis's life. And so there's this sort of like web of family connection, because Matthew Gregory Lewis's sister is married to Stephen Lushington's brother. And I've got letters, right, that connect the various different family members. Stephen Lushington, also too, known as an abolitionist, right, known for making moral stands. And abolition ties into this in significant ways, right? I've found that the people who support this most, if you take a stand against abolition, if you take a stand against cruelty to animals, if you take a stand for Catholic emancipation, if you take a stand for Jewish emancipation, you're more likely to be involved in this in some way. And again, it's hard to say, there's a lot of ambiguity in the evidence, but but this web starts to get denser and denser. Stephen Lushington was also the man who at a younger age was the primary legal advisor to Lady Byron when she was separating from Lord Byron. And all of the literature that's independent of anything that I'm doing, puts Stephen Lushington as the person most responsible for suggesting to Annabella, Lady Byron, that she used the allegation that Lord Byron had committed sodomy on her so that Byron would give up custody of their infant daughter, Ada, because Byron's parental rights were absolute at this point. He would get custody if he wanted custody. And so he's already publicly associated with the sodomy law, right, Stephen Lushington? And Lushington is actually blasted in print on several occasions for interfering with what a man and woman would choose to do in their private bedchamber and bringing the law into this. So this whole idea of like heterosexual sort of sodomy is a very public issue in the early 19th century through Lord Byron, right? So, and following this web of family connections, right? And following these sort of other connections helps me to connect these various different pieces. So as far as how to trace it, partially through the political system, partially through the family networks, partially through, again, newspapers and the sort of gossipy sections of newspapers that drop innuendos. And so that the web just kind of got denser and denser, and bits started referring back to each other. There are, and I'm careful in the book to say, I can prove this much or this much, I can put these two pieces this close together, and I try not to say any more than I can, but even that much, as you sort of said with the Austin reference, you can't say for sure that that's him underlining it, but, here are all of these pieces. And in a sense, right, you're following the legislation. So the narrative arc is the legislation as you're writing the book and reconstructing the story. And what I do is just along the way show all of these pieces that either totally connect up or almost connect up, but that are involved, that people are referencing. And it sort of adds to kind of the density and complexity, both of the politics of it, but also the sort of family dynamic. And this idea that love and affection within a family, right, is part of what makes a person hardy enough, brave enough to face the odium, right? Bentham's rational ideas got a lot of men to vote for this quietly, right? It got Lord John Russell to support it, but sort of behind the scenes, not committing the government. A lot of that more tepid support evaporates when one, probably the most reactionary Orange Order Protestant in the House of Lords is the one who stands up and says, if we pass this bill, we're supporting sodomy. Do you want to support sodomy? And he just repeats that word multiple times in a way that all of the supporters never used that word. And the more tepid supporters kind of evaporate. But it feels like that it's those with a family connection. And there are other family connections too, right? Members of parliament whose brothers have been caught up in sort of convictions, trials, accusations of sex between men show up prominently at key moments to move this forward also too. So, part of the argument is that, there may not be homosexual identity, but there is an affinity and a bond between family members that seems to be really, key to explaining why certain things happened in certain ways. I talked about family some in my first book, and I think that I'm really committed to thinking about that as a field that we need to be paying a lot of attention to when we think about same-sex desire and identity in the early 19th century, right? Because if the courtroom is one sort of system for adjudicating responsibility and meaning to acts, the family, right, is another, right? These negotiations that people do informally within their families to accommodate, behaviors that are, less than desired, and how do you move forward, right? Nobody calls it the worst of crime with the worst of crimes within a family, right? They figure out negotiations, right, and they move forward. But nobody, very few people, at least that are in my story, throw away their family members just because accusations have been made or behavior seems to confirm, certain types of desires.
Which is another really important point with this history. These, it's not just this the abstractions of high law that is devoid of flesh and blood, but in fact an intimate story of people's lives and family relations, as you're saying. And it's a great reminder of us as well that people did navigate these issues with the people that they were intimately connected to through blood, through connections later in life, through other associations. What's your sense of how people that might look familiar to us today in this period as resembling gay and lesbian people, LGBT people, but obviously understanding themselves in different ways? What's your understanding of how they navigated their own sense of self and how they understood themselves in this context?
One of the things is that almost every example that I've found of people who left significant writing, it's an argument that same-sex desire and opposite-sex desire can be present in the same person and natural to the same person. So that, I'm not using the label bisexual, right? Because it feels like a little bit artificial to put that in, but sort of that both types of desire as being natural and inborn in the same person is something that several people want to argue for, right? Even Bentham himself sort of, at one point has this passage where he says that, that it's primarily sort of about bisexual desire, right? That it would be kind of a perversion of taste to just totally be exclusive, in your desires towards other men. But that said, he reserves the right for people, to do that and still be able to, not be molested by the law, for instance. In fact, he has this kind of amazing passage where he says that he thinks that there are more people in his day that are exclusively attracted to other men because the laws are so much harsher against it. And he feels like that there's a relationship between the repression of a particular type of behavior and people's willingness, need to identify with that. If they feel it's a part of them, it becomes more of a part of them. So he actually has this sort of like wonderful kind of argument of how repression helps to create desire and identity around desire, which, could have come straight out of, it feels very much like what modern scholars have sort of been talking about, the relationship between the law and desire. And here it is in Bentham in the late 18th century. So yeah, there's sort of that argument for bisexual desire. There is let's see, I'm trying to think of some other examples. There are a lot of people who, it's very classed also too, to some extent. I mean, the thing that really gets you in trouble if you're an upper class man is to pursue a member of your own class. It can be forgiven if you are sort of, pursuing men of a lower social status and lower social rank. But what gets you have to leave the country, right? And I've got actually, in 1825, which is a real critical moment for this. I think the summer of 1825 has this explosion of arrests and prosecutions. This is the moment when Robert Peel passes a piece of legislation that's in direct dialogue with the Castlereagh suicide also too, in an attempt to give upper class men greater tools to stave off blackmailers. But at the same time that he passes this, he um, works to make sure that there are increased prosecutions, so that the government doesn't appear to be sort of, being lenient towards sodomites. And one of the people who gets caught up in this, Richard Heber, if you read material, the public association of him with sex between men happens in 1826 in a trial with a middle-class man, Charles Henry Hartshorne. But in fact, that story is a after the fact, not really what drove him out of Parliament. I discovered letters from the summer of 1825, where Robert Peel is negotiating the resignation of Heber from Parliament. And it's done by the brother of another person who's sort of associated with same-sex desire who brings this to Peel's attention. They set up this series of intermediaries too. Peel doesn't want to be too closely associated. So they set in two intermediaries, one between Peel. Peel has his man, right? Heber is told to get his man, and the letters pass between these four people to create a chain of deniability. Also, too, the first letter in the sequence has "burn after reading" written across the top. Fortunately, that wasn't done, so I was kind of able to follow this chain. But it's this sort of negotiation of them telling Heber, "We know what's going on. Do not deny it. If you act like you don't know what we're talking about, we won't be able to stop, all of the badness that's going to happen to you." I mean, they don't actually come right out and say it, but they're talking about it without leaving an explicit word, which is another reason why these letters, haven't been, I guess, more made out of them than they have. But yeah, they negotiate Heber's resignation in the summer of 1825. That's caught up with these events. But then the thing that becomes the public face of his association with sex between men, because this scandal was about Heber making sexual advances on two men of his own social class, and they were the sons of prominent men. But the public face of this is Heber being accused of having an improper relationship with the middle class Charles Henry Hartshorne, right? So this is kind of something else that's created so that with the more sensitive issue remaining hidden, the one that actually helped to facilitate the resignation. So yeah, there's this whole kind of like class politics and dynamic that's sort of tied up with these, as well as secrecy. I mean, I've got at one point near the end of the sequence of letters, Peel and his man sort of say, "Well, it looks like all this is wrapping up. Thank goodness we've been able to contain this, and keep these secrets, right, for the protection," basically says, "of our caste and, of our whole class of people." So anyway, that's just not only a wonderful insight into this particular moment, but it's also kind of an indication of why more records aren't left of other sort of incidents, right? Because it actually lets me see the care they took to create deniability and to not leave a written record. And how many other incidences along the way for the story did they actually burn the letters, right, after reading? We won't know, and you can't speculate based on what we don't know, but it's still kind of great to have this spelled out, right, in this way, at least in this one instance. Mm-hmm. That was a long answer. I'm sorry. I hope that does that address the question? Well,
no, yeah, and it goes in so many other areas that are really. I'm astonished by the records that are left behind, even knowing that suggests how much has been destroyed. But I'm just thinking back to your comments at the beginning about that Weeks made about this being a detective story and the work that had to be done to find these smoking guns, or at least you see again, like you say, it's not explicit, but of course this is the task of the historian that is immersed in the period to understand what these suggestions mean and what strategic silences mean, and to put your educated it's more obviously a lot more than guesswork, but to put your educated perspective into what these things can mean, knowing everything you know about reconstructing that world. And I was feeling jealous at a couple points that even as a 20th century historian, I can't always be sure that I'm going to find as exciting of sources and documents that put people where I need them to be when they should be for the story to proceed in the way that I think it's going to proceed, or the way that other sources suggest it's going to proceed. So it's I'm astonished by the amount of material that remains. I suppose that's the arrogance of the 20th century historian, that I assume there's far less in the past sometimes than there is for those of you that work in earlier periods. So it's just, I mean, it's really exciting to me to hear what your sources are, what they say, just how much remains, and that, yeah, burn after reading, that evidence of deliberate hiding of material, of evasion of topics, and all of that clearly suggests here are topics too hot to leave accessibly out there on the record, and yet they remain.
Right. No, absolutely. And part of like putting the book out there is that I hope I can draw more people into the late 18th and early 19th century. I think that there is a lot more that can be done. I think there are other topics that could be followed. I mean, the death penalty for sodomy became a pressure cooker because they were reforming the law code in general, right? I mean, we forget the law code had not been reformed at all at the start of the 19th century. Over 200 things got you the death penalty. And they are starting, it begins in three things are changed in around 1818 or so. And then around 1825, Peel has a pretty significant reform in 25. But then when the Whigs take over between 30 and the mid 40s, you get down to a dozen or so things that are capital. And as the death penalty for sodomy doesn't stand out so much when you also get the death penalty for picking someone's pocket over the value of 20 pounds. But when all that's left are versions of murder, treason, extreme violence, and a potentially private consensual act, right? This kind of creates even people who don't want to talk about it are kind of forced to deal with it, because the contradiction between what they think the law should be and what the law looks like in practice is becoming so sort of developed. Now, of course, in the death penalty, I mean, what I'm not contesting, of course, the last execution in 1835, judges, the death recorded, right? Judges deciding to, not execute even though a sentence of death is recorded. Also, to the Home Office, right? Judicial mercy, right, is something that can be exercised as well too, in order to stop executions. But they care about getting the law off the books, right? Because the law is still on the books, and people are very much interested in removing this, right? Even if there hasn't been an execution since 1835 forward. So, yeah, I think that the complexity of the story left a lot of records. I think there are other records that can be found. I think if people follow, I think maybe history of sexuality, I hope more people follow this sort of like high politics methodology to follow other pieces of legislation and backbench bills that never became law, right, that we might have forgotten about. They're still going to leave a trail that can be followed in a similar way. And I think it really does turn up perspectives that we don't expect. Also, too, something you said earlier about we assume things were worse in the past. I mean, I think that there is a real, there's an arc, right? I mean, it's sort of the greater Georgian openness on issues of sexuality of the 18th century, is extending into my period. In some ways, I think that this is kind of like the last gasp of that more liberal view about gender and sexuality. And things actually get worse from the mid 19th century forward. And all of those ways that the society gets more reactionary, more racist, more fearful of change rather than optimistic about change. That changes the way that they are approaching the death penalty for sodomy too. When it finally is taken off the books in 1861, it's in a very different group of people. It's in a very different atmosphere. And the way that it's done is far more punitive than anything that was suggested to get rid of it in the bills of 35, 40, or 41. So things got worse, for people who were motivated by same-sex desire. And that's part of why I kind of think that this should this could be a methodology for queer history going forward, right? Because I'm not really so much following identity, although identity statements are popping up, but they're not my story, but just a focus on how different, like marginalized groups kind of come together to put together political arguments that could create effective change to make more livable life for marginalized individuals in a period, right? How do you make an argument that brings people together in a period where people are saying that the death penalty for sodomy is justified, at least some? How do you build a coalition that almost succeeds in overturning that? And sort of creating political coalitions and political arguments to bring about change in a hostile political environment. That seems like something that queer history is, very interested in and doing all the time. And we can take this back right to earlier periods as a methodology. And again, in a period before modern queer identity, it gives us something to look for and study, because we're not going to find 100 Anlisters, right? We're not going to find 100 Chevalier d'Eons, people who left enough records to interrogate their identity. But what we can do is interrogate ethics by following the political system, right, in this way, I think. So that's sort of my pitch for why I think this isn't just a one-off for this methodology, but why I think we could really use this to tell a lot of interesting stories that will tell us new things about the 18th and early 19th century.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you're anticipating my final question, I suppose, and in addition to how it can impact or change our methodologies or give us new perspectives on how to look at the past. I suppose I would reframe that question slightly of saying, why does this history matter today?
Wow. Again, I think that showing that this issue was visible, was debated, and showing that there were that the Orange Order evangelical Protestants did not convince everyone, right? That there were people who disbelieved that as these ideas of that we associate with with the Enlightenment, with the rise of sensibility, with the movement for justice around abolition, right? And one of my key figures, Matthew Gregory Lewis inherits enslaved individuals, right, from his father. He had written a play before where a person of African descent gave an anti-slavery speech, and this got him in trouble, or at least looked at closely, right, by the licensor of plays. So, but now suddenly he was a slave owner. He doesn't renounce this, but within a very short period of doing this, he travels to Jamaica to inspect the estates. He attempts to end corporal punishment on the estates, and he dies on his second trip back from Jamaica to inspect to see if the reforms had an impact of yellow fever. I mean, I think that there's a connection to be had between thinking about people who are, interested in, affected by the humanitarian causes of their day, and to see that that could extend to the injustice of people subject to the sodomy law, that wasn't so wholly different. And so to establish that, right, to find those types of connections, to find the fact that, that applying these ideas to sexuality and same-sex desire was there, very early, perhaps even from the moment when liberal politics started to look at these ideas, of, trying to create, more humanitarian laws, right? And at least approaching these issues in this way. I think that if other people can find other evidence that speaks to this as well too, I think that would be phenomenally important. For how we think about modern queer politics, for how we think about the naturalness of applying issues of ethics and justice to sexuality, because it was there as those issues, were being applied, to other groups within society also too, as Mary Wollstonecraft was making her arguments as well, right? And so I think that that could be really significant if we could find other studies that found similar things. I'm making some preliminary forays into this, but I think I found something that I hope others will pick up on and also investigate, see what they find.
Well, I think it's certainly going to inspire people to explore these areas more, and certainly we need a lot more queer history that goes into these periods and these topics. I mean, let there be 100 more books, 100 more articles, 100 more research projects exploring these earlier periods, which are too often neglected. So thank you for that, and it's just been a treat chatting with you today. This is really a privilege to get the chance to sit down, even virtually, for an hour and chat about this. So I really thank you for your time and these perspectives.
Thank you so much, Justin. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. It's been a wonderful conversation. I'm delighted to be a part of the great series that you put together. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thanks so much.